It was 7:55 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of gray morning that feels heavy before the day even starts, and I was rushing to get into my work van, mind racing because I was already late for a $4,000 contract that was supposed to keep the lights on for another month, when suddenly, my body slammed into something hard, rough, and smelling of wet pine, stopping me dead in my tracks. I blinked, confused, staring at a 6-foot-tall privacy fence that definitely hadn't been there when I went to sleep 8 hours ago, a wooden barricade that now completely encircled my property like I was some kind of medieval prisoner. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute about property lines or loud music, folks. This was an act of war, a literal siege laid upon the land my grandmother, Nana Rose, left me, orchestrated by the one and only Patricia Sterling, the president of the Oakwood Preservation Society, a woman who wields her clipboard like a sword and treats the neighborhood bylaws like holy scripture. My security cameras, which I reviewed with shaking hands a few minutes later, caught the whole midnight operation, a hired crew working under silent floodlights like grave robbers, sinking posts and pouring quick-drying concrete with military precision, effectively turning my home into a maximum security penitentiary while I dreamt of paying my bills. Standing there, smelling the fresh sawdust and the looming disaster of a missed job, I realized this was the end game of a battle that had started 6 months ago, back when I was just Lucas Vance, a 40-something electrician trying to piece his life back together after a divorce that took the house, the dog, and my dignity, leaving me with nothing but legal fees and this inherited 1940s craftsman home in Oakwood Heights, Washington. You have to understand the geography here to understand the tragedy, because Oakwood Heights isn't a neighborhood, it's a regime, formed in the mid-90s when developers sliced up the rolling hills into cookie-cutter lots, inflating property values by 50% and attracting the kind of people who think a weed is a moral failing. My grandmother's house, however, was the original homestead, a stubborn relic sitting on 3/4 of an acre, legally distinct and predating their precious HOA by decades, a fact that drove Patricia Sterling absolutely insane. Patricia, 55, with a helmet of hair sprayed so stiff it could deflect bullets and driving a pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon, had been running this place like her own personal fiefdom for nearly a decade, measuring grass with a laser level and issuing fines for unauthorized shade of beige on a mailbox. She was also a high-end real estate shark, the kind who looks at a home and only sees a commission check, and my grandma's lot, this sprawling piece of history, was the last developable jewel in her crown. The nightmare began the week I moved in, before I even unpacked the first box, when I was hit by a wave of perfume that smelled like aggressive vanilla and money, followed by the click-clack of designer heels on my gravel driveway. I was fixing the porch railing when she materialized, holding a tablet like a weapon, introducing herself not with a welcome, but with a citation. "Mr. Vance, I'm Patricia Sterling, and we need to discuss the non-compliant outbuilding in your rear quadrant." She was talking about Nana Rose's potting shed, a structure that had weathered 50 winters and held more memories than her entire sterile house. And when she slapped me with a $2,500 removal order, I actually laughed in her face, telling her that shed was older than her authority and grandfathered in under every code since the Cold War. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold, dead cold, the look of a predator deciding how to play with its food, and she simply said, "In Oakwood, we have standards, and you will learn them." That was the moment the Cold War turned hot, because Patricia wasn't just an annoyance, she was plotting a takeover, and I found out later she'd been marketing my land as coming soon to investors for months. When I ignored her bogus fines, the harassment escalated from paper to physical, with daily wellness checks from local police based on anonymous calls, random city inspectors citing me for tall grass that I had just mowed, and a constant stream of letters from the Oakwood Preservation Society legal team. But the real gut punch, the moment I knew I was dealing with a psychopath, came 2 weeks later when I woke up to find my work van gone, vanished from my own driveway at dawn. It turned out that at 10 p.m. the previous night, Patricia had called an emergency board meeting, consisting of herself and her terrifying vice president, to pass a new rule banning commercial vehicles overnight, and my van was towed at 6:01 a.m. by Sterling Towing and Recovery. You can't make this up. The towing company was owned by her husband's family, and when I went to retrieve it, cash only, The guy behind the glass smirked like he knew exactly who I was. But here's the thing about bullies like Patricia: they get arrogant, they get sloppy, and they forget that in the modern world, cameras are everywhere. I pulled the footage from that night and saw her prowling my driveway at midnight, photographing my license plate, making calls, orchestrating the theft of my livelihood before the rule she created even technically existed. It was fraud, it was entrapment, and it was personal. I posted the video on the neighborhood app, captioning it, "The Dictator at Work," and my phone exploded with messages from neighbors like Mrs. Higgins down the street, an elderly widow who had been fined thousands for having a bird bath that Patricia simply didn't like. I started digging, really digging, and found that Patricia's own mansion violated half the code she enforced, with an unpermitted pool house and a fence that was 6 inches too high. But rules are for peasants, not for queens. I decided to hit back, contacting the contractors she used for HOA repairs and offering free electrical audits to the neighbors, revealing that 5 families had been scammed into paying for emergency electrical repairs that were totally unnecessary, recommended by Patricia, and performed by companies that kicked back fees to her. The next morning, the empire struck back hard, as a city building inspector named Officer Graves showed up, looking like he'd been bribed with a ham sandwich, claiming he had reports of dangerous, unlicensed wiring in my home. Patricia was standing right there at the curb, taking notes, looking smug, but when the inspector found nothing because my license is impeccable, she whispered to me, "You're a small fish in a big pond. Lucas, don't make me drain the water." That's when the cancellation started. 3 big clients dropped me in one afternoon, citing safety concerns they'd heard rumors about, and my business began to bleed out. But then, my buddy Mikey, a general contractor who takes zero garbage from anyone, recorded a call he got from her, a courtesy warning about my unsafe work, recommending her brother-in-law's company instead. That recording was the smoking gun for tortious interference, a legal term that basically means you messed with my money and now I own you. And I realized this wasn't just a feud, it was a racketeering operation. My lawyer, a shark named Elena Cross who eats HOA presidents for breakfast, started pulling records and found a pattern, a systemic grinder where Patricia would target vulnerable homeowners, widows, divorcees, the elderly, harass them with fines, isolate them socially, destroy their finances, and then generously offer to buy their homes for cash through a shell company called Sterling Horizons LLC. I was just the latest victim on her assembly line. But she had made a critical error. She assumed I was weak because I was broke, failing to realize that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy you can make. The harassment hit a fever pitch, with the fire department showing up for gas leaks that didn't exist and my internet lines being mysteriously cut. But I held my ground, sleeping with a baseball bat and documenting every single interaction. Then, the survey stakes appeared, orange flags popping up like poisonous mushrooms around my property line, marked by a company owned by, you guessed it, another one of Patricia's shell corporations. She caught me outside one evening, flanked by a nervous couple she was giving an unauthorized tour of my backyard to, and told me, "We're installing community access improvements for the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. Lucas, try not to be difficult." I didn't know what she meant until that Tuesday morning when I slammed into the fence, a 6-foot wall of spite that blocked my driveway, my front walk, and my only exit to the main road, forcing me to cross through a vacant lot next door that, surprise, surprise, Sterling Horizons LLC had quietly purchased the month before. She had physically checkmated me, trapping my van, trapping me, and cutting off my access to the world unless I trespassed on her land, turning my grandmother's sanctuary into a literal prison cell. Standing there in the morning mist, touching the cold wood of the fence, panic started to set in, a claustrophobic terror that I was going to lose the house, the business, everything. Because how do you fight someone who owns the ground you walk on? But then, staring at the grain of the wood, a memory flickered, a vague recollection of Nana Rose talking about the old ways and the old roads. And I turned around, running back into the house, tearing through the dusty boxes in the attic, searching for a specific manila envelope that smelled of lavender and 1940s paper. The attic was stiflingly hot, filled with the ghosts of the past, but I was on a mission, tearing through decades of tax returns and greeting cards until my fingers brushed against a thick, textured envelope labeled important. land, in Nana Rose's elegant cursive. I pulled out the deed, a document from 1945 that was yellowed and brittle, unfolding it with the reverence of a holy scroll, and began to read the dense legal jargon until my eyes landed on a paragraph that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. Perpetual agricultural easement, it said, granting the owner of my lot absolute, unrestricted right-of-way across all surrounding parcels for the movement of livestock, machinery, and farm operations. A right that ran with the land forever and superseded any modern subdivision rules. I sat there on the dusty floorboards and started laughing, a maniacal, breathless laugh, because Patricia Sterling hadn't just built a fence. She had built a trap for herself. I wasn't just the owner of a house. I was the legal warlord of the entire hill. I immediately called Elena Cross, my attorney, who read the document and let out a low whistle, saying, "Oh, Lucas, this isn't just a defense strategy. This is a nuclear launch code. She essentially built that fence on your legal driveway." But we didn't stop there, because while Elena drafted the motions, I went to the county clerk's office and did a deep dive into Patricia's finances, pulling the mortgage records on her little empire. It turned out that Queen of Oakwood was actually the Queen of Debt, leveraged to the hilt, owing nearly $100,000 in business loans for her shell companies, with payments she couldn't possibly make on her salary alone. She was drowning, frantic, and she had borrowed against the future value of the luxury condos she planned to build on my land. If she couldn't secure my lot, her loans would be called in, and she would lose everything. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just harassment. It was a desperate, clawing attempt to survive her own financial stupidity, and I was the only thing standing between her and total ruin. Armed with this knowledge, I called up my buddy David Chun, a surveyor who uses GPS equipment precise enough to measure the width of a hair, and he mapped out the easement, confirming that Patricia's spite fence was sitting exactly 15 feet inside my legal right-of-way. Then I called Mikey, who owns a fleet of heavy machinery, and asked him if he wanted to have some fun. The counterattack began at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, prime time for Patricia's beauty sleep. I didn't drive my van. I drove a massive, rumbling, diesel-spewing tractor that Mikey loaned me, right through the gate of her lot, exercising my agricultural access rights to the fullest extent of the 1945 law. I drove that beast right across her manicured lawn, the massive tires tearing up her perfect Kentucky bluegrass, the engine roaring like a dragon, and the look on her face as she ran out in her silk robe, screaming into her phone, was worth every penny of legal fees I'd accrued. When the police arrived, summoned by her shrieking demands for my arrest, I calmly handed the officer the laminated copy of the 1945 deed and the easement map. He looked at it, looked at her fence blocking my actual driveway, looked at the tractor, and suppressed a smile, telling Patricia, "Ma'am, this is a civil matter, but technically, you're obstructing his agricultural operation, so you might want to move your fence." She went nuclear, her face turning a shade of purple that isn't found in nature, screaming about property values and HOA bylaws. But the cop just tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing in the exhaust fumes of my victory. But we didn't stop at the tractor. We went for the throat. Elena filed a massive lawsuit for business interference, distress, and illegal obstruction, while I started a whisper campaign in the neighborhood, sharing the evidence of her scams with the other victims. Mrs. Higgins and a dozen others formed a secret coalition, meeting in my living room with the blinds drawn, comparing notes on the fines, the bullying, and the coercion. We discovered she had been funneling HOA funds into her personal legal defense, treating the neighborhood's reserves like her own piggy bank. Patricia, realizing her control was slipping, got desperate and sloppy. She started sending anonymous death threats to my voicemail, vandalizing my security lights with spray paint, and even tried to bribe me, showing up at my door with a lowball cash offer and a fake smile that looked like it was held in place by staples. "Think of your future, Lucas," she hissed. "You can't win against the board." I just smiled and pointed to the camera lens above the door, telling her, "I am the board now, Patricia." The turning point, the twist that sealed her fate, came when my private investigator found the link between Patricia, the tow truck company, and the city building inspector, Officer Graves. They weren't just friends. They were involved in a massive kickback scheme involving federal mail fraud and wire fraud, moving money across state lines to hide their assets. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. We were looking at a RICO case, the kind of organized crime charge usually reserved for the mafia, and Patricia Sterling was the Don. We quietly handed everything over to the FBI. The videos, the financial records, the recorded calls, the testimony from 15 ruined families, and they told us to sit tight and wait for the signal. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, like the air before a tornado, with Patricia doubling down, issuing fines to everyone who even looked at me, putting up posters warning of a dangerous resident, and trying to legally seize my home through an emergency injunction. She called a mandatory town hall meeting at the community center, intending to publicly shame me and force a vote to evict me, unaware that she was setting the stage for her own execution. The night of the town hall meeting, the Oakwood Community Center was packed tighter than a sardine can, the air thick with tension and the smell of cheap coffee and impending doom. 200 residents showed up, some terrified, some angry, all watching as Patricia Sterling took the stage, dressed in a power suit that probably cost more than my van, flanked by her corrupt board members and the sweaty building inspector, Graves. She launched into a tirade, a theatrical performance painting me as a violent, unstable criminal who was single-handedly destroying the property values of our beloved enclave, projecting grainy photos of my tractor on the screen like it was a tank invading Poland. "We must excise this cancer from our community," she shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured outrage, demanding the crowd vote to authorize extreme legal action against me. The room was silent, that heavy, fearful silence of people who have been beaten down for years, until Elena Cross stood up in the back row, cool as ice, and said, "Madam President, before we vote, I'd like to submit a few corrections to the record." Patricia tried to shout her down, but Mikey had already plugged his laptop into the AV system, and suddenly, the projector screen shifted. The audio filled the room, crystal clear and damning. It was Patricia's voice, recorded during her sabotage planning, saying, "Make sure Lucas's electrical panel is destroyed. Make it look like an accident. I want him bankrupt by Friday." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Then came the video of her directing the illegal fence construction, then the spreadsheets showing the stolen HOA funds, the kickbacks, the payments to Graves. Patricia froze, her face draining of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock, watching her entire carefully constructed life crumble in 4K resolution. Elena didn't stop. "This is not just mismanagement," she announced, her voice ringing off the rafters. "This is federal racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy." And right on cue, the double doors at the back of the hall burst open. It wasn't the local cops this time. It was men in windbreakers with those 3 terrifying yellow letters, FBI. They moved with a fluidity that was terrifying to watch, marching down the center aisle, while Patricia stumbled back, knocking over her podium, screaming, "This is a mistake. Do you know who I am?" The agent who cuffed her didn't even blink, reciting her rights while she shrieked about due process, a concept she had denied all of us for years. They arrested Graves right there in his chair, and 2 other board members, dragging them out past the stunned neighbors who were now standing up, pulling out their phones, recording the downfall of the tyrant. I walked up to the front, standing where she had stood moments before, and held up the 1945 deed. She thought she could fence me in, I told the room, my voice shaking just a little, but she forgot that the truth doesn't need a permit. The applause started with Mrs. Higgins and swelled into a roar, a cathartic release of 8 years of fear and frustration. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was spectacular. Patricia was charged with RICO violations, mail fraud, and embezzlement, facing a sentence that would keep her away for a decade. Her assets were frozen, the Mercedes repossessed, her house seized to pay restitution to the victims. The fence? We tore it down that weekend, a community party with sledgehammers and barbecue, turning the wood into a bonfire that lit up the night sky. 6 months later, Oakwood Heights is a different world. We elected a new board with total transparency, refunded the bogus fines, and used the recovered money to build a community garden on the vacant lot Patricia had tried to use to choke me out. My business is booming, branded now as the electrician who fought back, and I finally renovated Nana Rose's house the way she deserved. Elena and I, well, Let's just say we've had a few dinners that weren't billable hours. But standing here on my porch, watching the sunset over an open, fence-free yard, I can't help but think about the cost of it all. We got justice, sure, but it took a nuclear option to stop a petty tyrant who was allowed to ruin lives for years because nobody wanted to rock the boat. It makes you wonder, at what point does enforcing standards become oppression? And why do we give these little dictators so much power over our sanctuaries in the first place? Is it right that I had to find a 70-year-old piece of paper to have basic human rights in my own home? Or is the system itself designed to let the patricius of the world win until someone is crazy enough to drive a tractor through their front lawn? Let me know what you think in the comments. Did she get what she deserved, or was I too harsh? Don't forget to like and subscribe, because next week, we're exposing a corrupt mayor who tried to steal a playground. Stay free, everyone.